So, Alex Gibney, We Still Secrets, the story of WikiLeaks. Excellent documentary, by the way. That's no
Thanks.
surprise coming from you. But I've got to say, I mean, it's a really thorough. We work in the news business here, and so I'm pretty much aware of what's going on in the WikiLeaks story. And there were still things about, especially Julian Assange, that I didn't know, but also about Bradley Manning. And that's what I think in our short time, what I want to focus on is you have a documentary that has two complex but definitely fascinating personalities at its heart, Bradley Manning and especially Julian Assange. There's a third element I want to get in this, and that's the sort of government representatives or people from the government that also are a fascinating third wheel. But let's start with Julian Assange. What do you make of him? He is in a lot of ways a very charismatic character. What is it appealing about him? What is so striking about him, and why are people so drawn to him, either positively or negatively?
Well, look, he is a striking character. He is a charismatic character, and I think there's a lot about Julian to be admired. I mean, he's got brass balls, and I think his instincts are all right in the sense, or at least they were in the beginning, in the sense that he wanted to hold corporations and governments to account and felt that there were too many secrets. Those secrets needed to be revealed, and in so doing, he would... to use Justice Brandeis's phrase, he would be a devotee of somebody who says that sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? He would leak the secrets, all would be well. I think the problem was that over time, particularly after he became one of the most famous people on the planet for a brief period, he became so self-regarding, and the mission of WikiLeaks then became conflated with the mission of Julian Assange, and somehow he imagined himself as personifying the transparency agenda. And so suddenly his organization starts to become more secret. His organization starts to become more like the CIA. Now, obviously, it's not like it doesn't have the power of the Central Intelligence Agency. When suddenly he's forcing people in the organization to sign non-disclosure agreements, with a $12 million penalty, suddenly everything's turned upside down. And I think, to me, the big problem, too, WikiLeaks is supposed to be about the truth. And I think for Julian, this Swedish episode with the allegations of sexual abuse, that could have been purely a personal matter, but Julian intentionally turned it into something that had to do with the whole transparency agenda, and it really didn't have anything to do with it.
Okay, now, and see, that I find fascinating. Yeah, the movie, I wouldn't suggest that it's pro Julian Assange early on, but it definitely shows that he thinks of himself as a crusader, for all that's good, at least in his mind. And the movie takes a real turn, as does your opinion, I think, of him with these Swedish accusations. Now, there are a lot of people, and you have them in your movie, who say, oh, come on. Right when he is at his peak of power, suddenly these charges seem to come out of nowhere. Clearly, they're set up. They're a plant. Do you sort of dismiss those suspicions as nothing but paranoia?
Look, I was one of those people who thought that's exactly what was going on, that it was a honey trap, that it was some kind of CIA put-up job. I assumed that. But I looked into it. And frankly, I went over to Sweden. I talked to the guy who was Julian's host at the time. Ultimately, we talked to one of the women. There's no evidence that I've been able to discern that suggests that this was anything other than one guy behaving badly. And then we'll see whether or not, if he ever goes to trial in Sweden, whether he was behaving in a way that was criminal. But Julian, by intent, I think, linked the two because it was a better story. And also, it doesn't look so good for some guy suddenly in the midst of a hugely worldwide important series of leaks to be caught in the midst of a sex scandal in Sweden.
Right.
So I think that he changed the story.
And your movie does a great job of kind of demonstrating that. The thing is, how serious are these charges? When we first heard of these charges, the idea is that he somehow broke a condom intentionally or wasn't using one when he had one. And I'm thinking of the millions of people, let's say, that Mick Jagger must have bedded, and none of this has ever come to light about Mick Jagger has never dealt with these charges like Julian, Assange has. Does that at all strike you as a little bizarre or kind of out of left field?
Well, look, I do think that one of the reasons that this became so public was because he was already a celebrity, he being Julian Assange. And I think if he hadn't been a celebrity, things wouldn't have become as public as they did. But let's also be honest and say that what happened here was pretty simple. Two women got together, and they were both upset with the way that Julian was having sex with them without a condom. In one case, it was alleged that he broke it. In the other case, he entered her while she was asleep. So all they wanted was for him to go get an HIV test. That was what they wanted. They weren't going to the police for any other reason, ultimately, than to force Julian to take an HIV test. It was once they go to the police decide then to ratchet it up to the level of an investigation. Because actually, the idea, there's a guy in Canada, I think, who's spending a few years in jail. He intentionally tried to make his longtime girlfriend pregnant against her will. And we also know that if you're intentionally having sex with somebody and you do have the HIV virus, that's assault. Right. So potentially these are serious charges. And Julian will say they aren't charges. The fact is, according to the Swedish legal system, he can't be charged until he's arrested, and he can't be arrested until he goes to Sweden.
Fair enough. So, okay, and that's a fascinating aspect of the case, that he has somehow fused his own personal situation into a crisis for WikiLeaks, and then he ends up bringing WikiLeaks down in his effort to kind of save himself. That's, in effect, your thesis in the movie? Well,
I wouldn't say. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why WikiLeaks gets brought down, and of course, WikiLeaks is still an active, ongoing organization. They just, cataloged these National Archives Henry Kissinger files, but they're not doing the and they were legitimately. I mean, they were not legitimately. They were, I would say, illegitimately targeted by Visa, MasterCard. And others, in a way that, say, the Ku Klux Klan has never been. The Visa and MasterCard will gleefully accept payments from the Ku Klux Klan. So, but I think what happened was that the problem here is that WikiLeaks is supposed to be about the truth. And I think what happened was that for his own personal benefit, and for a while it made him much more famous, instead of accepting responsibility and being willing to be held to account, which is, after all, what he likes to do to other people, he tried to imagine that somehow this was all a put-up job. And in so doing, this truth-telling organization begins to construct a magnificent lie. And that, to me, is the heart of the story and what we need to get after.
I see. So ultimately, do you think if he walked out of that Ecuadorian embassy and said, okay, Sweden, here I am, do you think the charges would stick, and would he be in prison for a long time?
I'm not sure that he would be. I mean, he's got his fear, and I do think he fears this. His fear is that this whole thing about Sweden is actually being manipulated by the United States, and if he were to go to Sweden, then the United States would pounce, and they'd pull him back to the United States. His lawyer at one time said he'd be sent on a cargo plane to Guantanamo. Yeah. Okay. But I think the point here is that if he were to go back to Sweden, justice then would be done, and we'd see whether or not those charges stick. I think that's the point. The point is that justice delayed is justice denied in this case.
Gotcha. And I think you do point out, or one of your talking heads maybe does point out that he would, in Britain, it's easier to extradite the United States
it is.
Britain than Sweden. So this idea that he can't go to Sweden for some reason, he was hanging out in Great Britain, doesn't hold quite as much water.
No, that's absolutely true.
Okay. One other thing, last thing about Julian Assange. Where did you get the eeriest piece of video I think I've seen in a year is him on the dance floor at some disco? I'm imagining that when you first saw that, you just thought, Eureka! I mean,
it was the DJ.
It was a DJ? Okay.
The DJ took the footage.
And tell me what it depicts and how you got it and why you include that in your movie.
There's just a moment. I mean, it's a playful moment. Honestly, we're talking about Bradley Manning's leaks, and Bradley Manning himself, through his chats, says that he would go in and pretend to be listening to music, and he brought along with him CDs, and he would download all this information into the CD. And he said at one point, while he was cheerily downloading all this data, the biggest leak in history, he was listening to Lady Gaga's telephone. So we played Lady Gaga's telephone, and you kind of see a montage of of the leaks and so forth and so on. And then it cuts hard to Julian Assange dancing in that disco. So alone,
Yeah.
right? Wild arms moving about, sort of like an octopus.
Yeah.
And it's spectacular. And there's a kind of playful quality to that. Obviously, Julian got a lot of joy out of getting all those leaks.
Yeah. Okay, you mentioned Bradley Manning. We don't have a lot of time, so Bradley Manning is the other big character in this. He's, I don't know if he's called a troubled soul or something like that in the movie. He clearly is dealing with all sorts of demons. He's has issues with sexual identity. Talk about the significance of Bradley Manning in the story of WikiLeaks and in your documentary, and what your take on him is.
Look, I think that Bradley Manning for a long time was the missing character in this story. Everybody knew about Julian Assange. Everybody knew about WikiLeaks. We called them the WikiLeaks cables. But this famous video of the helicopter gunship killing 2 Reuters reporters, the Iraq war logs, the Afghan war logs, and the State Department cables, all these come from one person, Bradley Manning. Right. And he's admitted that now. So, it was bizarre that for so long he wasn't at the heart of this story, but we felt it was vital to put him in as a central figure in this story. And he's a very interesting character. He's a guy who is he's super smart. He's very good with computers. The Army desperately needs him, even though he's clearly not Army material. He's a volatile character. He's gay with issues of sexual identity, possibly, wanting to change his gender. And he's in the military at a time of don't ask, don't tell. But he also has a growing degree of political consciousness. He's very smart, and he's seeing things in materials that he thinks are just dead wrong. So over time, he decides that this is stuff that must be known. And we know that because of what he says in these chats. So that's very powerful and important. But this other aspect of the whole leaking relationship is important, too, because I started this story thinking that it was about an electronic Dropbox, a machine, where you can leak anonymously. And that's how Bradley Manning originally leaked to WikiLeaks. But not all that material first. Later, he became persuaded that he should leak some other stuff. And I think at the end of the day, having leaked all that material to WikiLeaks, there is a mystery that remains, which is why then would this guy, who has done the biggest leak in history, reach out to a complete stranger, this gray hat hacker named Adrian Lamo, and tell him everything that he had done? And ultimately Lamo turns him in. But not only does he tell him what he's done, but he reaches out to Lamo, who is a publicly bisexual, because he wants to tell him a lot about who he is and to discuss some of his own issues and problems. So it's clear that he was lonely. He needed somebody to talk to, and he wasn't getting what he needed from his relationship to WikiLeaks. So he reaches out to Lama, and Lama ultimately betrays him. So that whole aspect of the leaking process ultimately becomes very interesting and important. It's not so much about a machine. It turns out it's about human beings.
Yes, very much so. And what is the relationship? You end up having a kind of link. You find a link between Assange, we think, or someone who has, I don't know if it's a web address or something that links Assange with Bradley Manning. Do you think that Assange in some way manipulated Bradley Manning in any way, or was he just the conduit that Manning was seeking to release this stuff?
The fact is we don't know, but we do know that the U.S. military has a number of chats, some of which they've released and some of which they haven't, between Bradley Manning and a person we think is Julian Assange. Bradley Manning thought it was Julian Assange. There's no definitive proof that that's the case. He lists, in his address book, he lists the address for the chat as belonging to Julian Assange. So it seems clear that prior to the leak of the State Department documents, there was a conversation going on between Bradley Manning and WikiLeaks and someone he thought was Julian Assange, and may have been. To me, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, essentially, we don't know. We haven't seen the chats, but it does indicate that that's more of a kind of traditional conversation between a source and a publisher, or a source and a journalist. There are a lot of journalists who talk to sources and talk them into releasing material in a way that is perfectly appropriate. And that may have been the case in this instance. It may also be that the U.S. government is trying to prove that there was something else going on here, that perhaps Julian Assange helped Bradley Manning break in, but we don't know that yet.
Yeah. And what can you briefly describe the relationship between WikiLeaks and Anonymous?
Well, I think Anonymous was a kind of organization that was necessarily friendly to the goals of WikiLeaks. And then when WikiLeaks was attacked, effectively by MasterCard and Visa, when they refused to process payments to WikiLeaks, Anonymous attacked MasterCard and Visa. And so it was a very interesting phenomenon where suddenly you see a battle going on in the internet over this whole issue of a kind of sense of rough justice.
Right. Okay, and then finally, I mentioned this third part of your movie. You have some great government, I think they're former government officials, but
yeah.
This was you who actually in a lot of ways say that they agree that the government should be releasing a lot more of these documents, that what WikiLeaks did in philosophy, they didn't exactly disagree necessarily. Am I correct?
Well, one of them in particular, a guy named Bill Leonard, who used to be the classification czar for the Bush administration, he believes that far too much is being classified, that we're overclassifying material in a very dramatic way. In fact, he says that on the books, the punishment for overclassifying material should be as severe as leaking classified material, but we never apply the former.
Right.
The other guy, the other government official who appears in the film, is Michael Hayden, the former head of the CIA and the former head of the NSA. Yeah. It's from Michael Hayden that we get the title of the film.
Yes, in fact, I thought it was a curious choice, since so much when we think of WikiLeaks, we all think of Julian Assange, and then we might think of Bradley Manning. You choose to take words out of a government official's mouth, a CIA director's mouth, to actually title your movie. Why did you do that, and what's the significance of that?
What Michael Hayden says is, let me make this clear, Alex. He says, we steal secrets. That's what we do. And in order to do that, you can't do it above board. So he's saying, well, we steal secrets, so we have to be secret about stealing secrets. Well, okay, fine. But that sets this whole argument about what should be secret and what should not be secret in a broader context. Suddenly, it's not so simple. The idea that sometimes stealing secrets is good, I guess. Maybe sometimes leaking secrets is good also. So it gets to this issue of a grayer zone about what should and should not be secret. The military would like to portray these leaks as absolutely an abomination. They said that Assange had blood on his hands. I don't think that's true at all. I don't think anybody was hurt. I think what happened was that the government was embarrassed. Governments don't like to be embarrassed. So I use that quote from Michael Hayden as a way of putting this whole thing in context.
And again, this is a more minor aspect, but I thought it was fascinating because people are offering their take. Do you psychoanalyze Julian Assange? I mean, they sort of say, well, he's this way because of this, or he's like he had to have everything perfect, or do you, having spent this much time with him, and I assume you tried to get an interview with him and you didn't get very far. Do you have a particular psychological reading of why he is the way he is?
I think there are a couple of aspects. I mean, look, much has been said that he's a guy who grew up very much on his own. His mother was fleeing a former boyfriend who was in a cult, and they were moving constantly. And so his connection with the outside world was always the internet. Here was a guy who very much like other hackers of his age and time, did their exploring through a computer, through the internet. And in that world, it becomes a world of the imagination. So he lives intensely in his imagination. And I think that's part of the issue with Julian Assange. So he imagines things to be, like this Swedish episode, to be a certain way. And then, presto changeo, they are that way. I think also, Julian, having spent so much time on his own, or perhaps that's his personality anyway, displays the traits of a classic narcissist. So he sees everything in terms of himself. Suddenly the transparency agenda is all about Julian Assange. You can't separate Julian Assange or the transparency agenda. And that, I think, is too bad, because he's not able to listen as well as he might. And had he been able to listen more, I think this great moment could have been an even greater moment.
Fantastic. We've got to run. Weren't you working on a movie about Lance Armstrong?
Still am.
Still are. What is the status of that?
The status is we're getting close and probably be finished, and I would expect it'll be available sometime in the fall.
Wow. And I assume your take today is different than the take you had when you first came up with the idea to do a documentary on Lance Armstrong, or no?
You think?
I had to ask. Okay, great. Thanks a lot,
Okay,
Alex.
thanks.
Congratulations. By the way.
Pleasure.
Very good.